Yeah.
Heavy bloody, yeah.
Is it really heavy?
Yeah, I think I like
It's heavy, isn't it?
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, should we do this one?
Whatever that one is, yeah, I'd rather not carry it.
No, exactly.
Just to stay where it is.
Stone. Come on. Hold on. You're right there.
Yeah, hopefully it's still in place.
You're on the stage. Hello, how are you, Richard?
Hey there, you're all right.
I think
Gordon.
No, Gordon.
Do you want to squeeze past it? Because they take a little while.
Should I carry it with you?
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
What we'll do?
that's what I was going to do.
Yeah, just because I think the bottom bit might flap open,
Yeah.
so I want to just.
Can we put it in there? Yeah?
Yeah, I think so. Might have
Turn, ready, steady. Painting.
And I might move over chairs because
This one.
yeah, this.
For me.
Yeah, I think one of these
I responded to you in the email.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah, you didn't comment so much on what the content was, but you added the other points,
Yeah.
which are discussed.
Richard, can you remember who I'm supposed to be sending these links to?
No,
Right?
no, I don't.
Yeah, I was,
I don't.
And it's just anybody who might be interested who test it.
Yeah, but I didn't know who was on last week. Ah. Well, there are no recipients of this one.
It doesn't say on here, does it? Oh, right, this has gone to Wales.
Mary,
Yeah?
I'm just trying to send this, we're testing this live streaming. I want to send, I'm sending it to people the link so they can look at it tonight
Okay.
while the meeting's going on.
Okay.
Who in the start? You've got to send it to the start?
No, you say Cliff, because he's not there tomorrow, you see.
No, but then now, you've got to be there now.
He won't be there now.
Not
Now?
at the start, but I mean, I can send it to their home. Anybody.
Does it have to be somebody from the start?
No.
I don't know who's in that home.
See, I'm sending it to John Foster,
Yeah.
Simon Renton, Ryan Dealey,
Mm-hmm.
Alex Cooley, Marion, Gowan Little, Phil Katz. It might be good to send it to somebody at the start.
Yeah. Now is.
No, not when you're there, it could be at home, so you can perceive what the potential of it.
Well, then do Ben Chacker. They are. Actually.
What's his email, Mary?
I think it's ben.chacker@peoplepress.com.
Is it people's kind of hyphen?
We've got many books about that.
Of course, very
Huge amount.
hugely complicated.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. You're
Who's the other guy? The guy whose sister's
Oh.
hanging out.
The house again.
Whose sister is hanging
Dangerous subject.
subject.
How
That's true. Very dangerous.
It shouldn't it?
The other person you could send it to is Tom Gill.
Yeah. Tom Gill.
Tom is always good. Morning Star, if anybody wants a Morning Star.
You mean
It costs £1.20.
you mean there's a possibility we haven't got ours?
No comment, Richard.
Oh, I see.
Oh.
No, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Anybody else for a Morning Star? No? Hello, how are you? Very good.
You can't see your boss that.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
You're right.
Thank you.
Good, good.
State of Revolution. We need to see what we think. Hmm?
True, yeah.
Who was it you was...
Rather than buying them on Amazon.
I don't know about it. Who did you mention another publishing company?
Marxists.org, they do a lot of, they got a lot of PDFs of
Yes, PDFs.
texts. Yeah. And I personally did the, just for the Marx,
Yeah.
which download on the zip file. It's just for me to read over
Yeah.
time, you know?
Did you succeed? Yes.
Well, I've sent it to them, right?
Right.
So it's a question of whether they're going to do it. Some of them are definitely going to do
Trying to keep my bowels.
Sorry?
Trying to keep my bowels before I fall down.
Don't fall down.
Yeah.
So if you go on that street.
Yeah.
I'll show you when it's actually going with the sound because I've got this omnidirectional mic.
So basically you just hear the speakers.
You see the speaker, yeah, but I'm trying to do something more complicated. I've actually got the slides on this thing as well.
Oh, great.
So I'm trying to cut between the slides.
Right.
It's a bit difficult to correlate, to sort of coordinate.
Right.
I'm getting better at it. You need to learn, it's like anything, you need to learn actually use the software.
Because that could be put into taken over.
We put stuff on the table.
It is very good stuff.
All the
Yeah.
Surely years ago, 15 years ago, I read one corrected books. I would say it was Lenin in Turkey.
Did you? Are you Turkish?
Yeah.
Okay.
For that I have to go to prison, of course. In Turkey.
Right.
Yeah, so the theory of state and revolution in Turkey is different down this country.
Really?
Exciting up there.
Turkey is not a like different developed capitalist country.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So it's the application you're talking about.
Application of revolution
The
was
old
a method of revolution in Turkey.
Okay.
Our main contradiction is now between the Turkish and the Western imperials led by the Americans.
Yes.
Which affected like started in the 1920s. That collapsed all over again, against imperialism. I mean, for this country, straight away socialism, because there is a developed working class, and now it's and also the villages.
Yeah. But you see,
Develop in this country, but in Turkey, it's not like that. So the workers, proletariat, and the peasantry should be in alliance in Turkey.
right.
So quite different.
Yeah.
Anyway, are you Turkish?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Hello. Oh, hello, Ivan. You look better. Hello. You look better. Well, yeah. I haven't even got the one around here in my blood. No, I can. I was not looking at it, but I didn't. Yeah, because I don't see songs all the time. I go to the library. Use the computer. I haven't got a computer in my room.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, no complaint, Yeah.
I picked this up for nothing at Houseman's the other day, and for obvious reasons we can't lose it here. But I thought if you hadn't seen it, you
Oh, I
might be
haven't,
able to
no.
use it.
Labour Party Marxist.
Huh?
Labour Party Marxist. Oh.
Yeah.
Free donations. Oh.
Oh gosh, it's so silent. Where is that? I was waiting for you.
I'm going to wait till 5 past, so I think you could wait on the door till. They don't.
They've got a copy of
I'll tell you why. Listen. Oh. Hope they're not coming. Do you want it back?
No, I want you to have it.
Oh, thank you.
I picked it up for nothing at Houseman.
Oh, right.
On
Okay.
the
Well,
free
then
table, and
it's free. It is free. Look,
Yes.
donations welcome.
as we've no intention of doing anything
Good.
like that in Finsbury, well,
Good.
you might have a hole for it.
No, I don't think so. I think this looks a bit.
Mary, can I start with an apology for the Morning Star?
Can you just wait on the door for 5
Oh, okay,
minutes?
yeah.
Because
Okay.
they mustn't ring it because there's a meeting upstairs.
Ah, right, okay.
Okay, so come back in 4 minutes' time. You can talk amongst yourselves. I'm not going to start for a few minutes. Well, 4 minutes to be precise.
Although he's got a majority of the whole council, I imagine he's made the finance that
No, I just think that I could only
Surely,
not only is 5,000, but its majority is 5,000. It's like Trump. So many moments in the campaign where you think it should have been all over at that point. When you think this or said this thing, it's like it should have been all over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I?
Was there anybody else?
Sorry?
That wasn't somebody. No?
No.
No. Yes.
Folks, for those who were avidly waiting for the last week's instalment in yesterday's Morning Star, it wasn't there. I have to apologise for some confusion on the copy desk, but I'm assured that it will be, we hope, next week. But that means everything will be back a week. Next week will be Marxist philosophy. The week after, hopefully, or maybe 2 weeks
Most
after,
people
will
weren't
be-
here last week, actually.
Was
You
anyone
better
not here last
explain.
week?
Yeah, there was quite a few.
Okay. In that case, can I give these out now? Just not for this evening's one, but the one that they're
Yeah.
doing now. Okay. In that case, for those who didn't get it, those who weren't here, last week we were talking about Marxist economics, and we spent the last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes, last week we had this. We can spend just 2 minutes now getting any feedback you might have on this, which is the copy for an article to come out shortly in the Star. Yeah? And I think we've got, yes, we have the last one. There you go. Okay. Is this right, Mary? So we're talking about just doing the article. Yeah? So any feedback on the article for those who have had time to read it since last week? This was handed out at the end of last week. The idea is that you've come having read it word by word with comments, criticisms, suggestions, ideas, ways in which it could be tweaked.
But because for those of you who don't know, this article will appear on the Morning Star under the full marks column, and this is a new way of doing things because you can say what it says at the end on, Richard, because people don't know.
Yeah?
No,
So, any feedback?
Explain that it's a that your comments will be included, because at the bottom of the article, when it's printed, it will say this article has been discussed by those attending the Introduction to Marxism course at Marx Memorial Library. So your contributions collectively are noted in print in the Morning Star. You should read the Morning Star if you don't already. It's a daily newspaper. It's the only socialist English language daily newspaper in the entire world. That's it.
And
End
there
of
are 2
advert.
copies there, Mary.
She's
Yes.
right. Okay.
Thank you, Mary.
And it actually might say collectively edited
Yes,
by
collectively.
this class. So this is your opportunity to collectively edit. Or if you're reluctant to come forward with criticisms and comment now, what you could do is scroll them on that copy and hand them in at the end, and Mary and I will incorporate them, or not.
At the end of
Depending on
today, you will get another one on this theme, State and Revolution,
Yeah.
but it is the last class, so you'll have to, any comments you can send to us, we'll leave an email, well, yes, we'll leave our emails. Shall we start?
Yep.
Okay. So, today, for those of you who haven't been here before, this is, or was supposed to be, a course of 4 sessions, and this is the final session. The first one was historical materialism, the second one was on Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism, the third one was on Marxist economics, labour theory of value, and today we're going to decide how to change the world. That's why you're here, right? Okay, so we need to understand the world in order to change it. So the first 3 classes were quite important, but we do need to understand what the state is, and so that's what today is going to be about. There's far too much to do, really, so you could all come back next week for the State and Revolution Part 2 and then Part 3 and so on, but we'll do as much as we can. Okay, so people get quite confused about the state. I suppose the conventional view that probably we all grow up with is that the state is neutral. It's a nice thing. It's above society. It enables reconciliation. It's the honest broker. You can't see it, but it's there. But it doesn't do us any harm, and it mediates between all views. That's not the view that Marxists would take of the state. The absolute opposite. To quote Engels,
Mary, sorry, the slide hasn't gone on.
oh, has it not?
You need to click
But
it.
I did.
I don't know why it's not.
Why isn't it? There you are. Is that on now?
No, okay.
Why isn't
Do
it?
you want to
there?
carry on talking while I do it?
Yes. But why?
Okay.
Oh,
carry
I
on.
have to. God, this is.
No, you just carry on.
I can't.
Damn it.
I try.
Right, okay. Mary, carry on while I just sort the screen.
Okay. So, the Marxist view of the state is that it's the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, and it exists not to mediate them, but to represent the class which is dominant in society. And I do wish I could get to the next one.
For some reason,
Oh, this is a
bloody
slight
thing's
technical
frozen.
bit. Just hold on to that thought. The state is not neutral. It is actually there to protect the interests of the class that rules, and it's the product of the conflict between classes rather than to reconcile classes. And we'll have to prove this, I know. But just hold that thought. It's not nice, the state. And we have to get rid of it if we're going to do anything. That's really... Okay, you can go home now. Worked a minute ago, actually.
Yeah, I know. It seems to have frozen for some reason.
Shall I get another computer?
Okay, go on. You just chat, Mary.
Well, I can't remember.
Well, say it again.
No.
So the two views of the state.
Shall I? Yeah. Okay. So what I was going to do, or what I am going to do, is with visual aids, is to is to say what Marx, Engels, and Lenin said about the state and how it developed, and then to look at the state today, the modern state, the state that we're living in, looking at that in two ways. One is with the modern state part one, but the modern state part two is the product. It's state, we call it state monopoly capitalism. But I do need these slides actually, because do you know what? I'm only using slides because he shamed me into using. I never use PowerPoint or anything, and now I'm completely dependent on it. Yes.
Is there a remote control to the projector? Maybe that's why it's frozen?
What?
Good point.
Look what?
Remote control.
Turn it off and on again. Yeah.
Did you hear that?
What, the beamer, you mean? Okay, we'll do that.
You can usually freeze it.
That's the door, I think. Let me just go and ask. Door one.
Don't need to open the door.
What?
Don't need to open the door.
Well, I have to. That was the bell, wasn't it?
I didn't hear down.
You do.
Okay.
Probably the state is doing that. You see, the state is doing that. This is the power of the state.
This is the power
Power
of
of
the
the
state.
state, and that is what is happening.
It's not neutral.
I remember as soon as when you start there, actually we have seen that one.
I know.
You open it.
I know.
So
It must
how
work.
could that disappear?
Exactly, because I was fiddling with it and it didn't work. No,
Was it working before, Mary?
Huh?
When you were fiddling with it, it worked?
Yeah. Yeah, I tested it.
Oh, there, look.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's the window of the one.
Yeah, I know.
Have we got any computer experts?
He is. Certainly not me.
Not
Why
on this
isn't it
one, no.
that
But you can still go ahead theoretically.
I could.
We follow you know.
Okay.
Yeah, you can talk.
Well, if only I can. I'll just need to get my notes because that's.
Also,
Oh, this is a bloody news.
I think
Shall
it's because you've got it on the stick. Can I copy it over
Go
to
on
you?
then.
Okay.
From the beginning of time, we've already talked about the development of class society, haven't we? Well, those of us who are here. Class society developed, if you can remember, those of you who were here before, when society could produce a surplus. And we looked at the three stages or three modes of production, the most dominant mode of production, starting with slavery, then feudalism, and now capitalism. And in each stage, this is putting it ever so, compressing a whole of a lot into a few sentences, whilst we're waiting for that, that each stage, each mode of production produces a different form of state. So society, when it, in what was called primitive communism, before class society, before people could produce a surplus, i.e. just produce for their own immediate needs, no state was required. Basically, you had it's sometimes called primitive communism, because everything was shared. Once class society developed, and coinciding with the development of class society, the monogamous nuclear family developed because of the essential point, this is what Engels talks about, of ensuring that property was passed through the male line, i.e. through and that male line was of undisputed parentage, which is why women's oppression took. We discussed this a bit. So the first form of state probably was more like bodies of armed men, as we go into feudal society, again, there's conflicts within the ruling class. Those who are the most dominant, usually the people who've got the most horses, the money and land, come to dominate, and monarchy often, or divine right, there's no parliamentary democracy. You get into bourgeois society, capitalist society, and the state develops yet again into different forms. And those of different forms, oh God, this is so awful. I haven't even got notes because it's all there.
Turn it off and turn it on again. Turn it off and turn it on again. Always use the same.
So the state then is not neutral. How it operates is something that we need to look at, especially in capitalist society, in capitalist class society. It's much more sophisticated than ever it was. It's not just a question of having I think this is going to work now.
You carry on.
Yes. So the more sophisticated version of the state that we see today is not simply Parliament. Parliament, I would argue, is window dressing. Is window dressing because the state is something that we don't really. Oh, this is going to work now. I think. I'm going to wait just for a minute, because if it does work, then I'm going to. Yeah. It's going to be much more helpful to you and me. So just while we are waiting, I've just said what I think Mark says about the state. What is your view? What do you think the state is? Just before we go on to look at it in the most complicated way. Anybody got any views?
The dominant class superstructure.
Part of the
power
superstructure?
Yeah, dominant classes.
The dominant class dominates.
The ruling class.
Yeah.
The ruling class rules through the state.
State.
Anybody
It
disagree
contains
with
the
that?
coercive forces as well.
Sorry?
It contains the coercive forces, the instruments of
Yes.
force and legislation and
Like the army and the
Yes,
navy and
yes.
the-
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. No, but it's the man behind you's got his hand up. Yeah.
You can re-elect it. Yeah, I mean, presumably the state always exists. So whatever system exists, there's going to be a state.
Well, the argument is that it only existed when class society began to exist.
But for example, I mean, presumably we're not talking from a sort of Trotskyist perspective where nothing is ever good enough. I mean, my idea of socialism is something that's concrete, so even conscious society.
Okay. Well done, Richard. Okay, so we've done that. We've done that. Bored with that.
This one you see.
Oh yeah. This one?
Yes.
Oh, I can't do it left-handed. All right, I'll try. Okay, so what's... Okay, so... Marxism and the state. Okay, so Marx didn't say an awful lot about the state, actually. It was really Engels that said most. And Lenin said something, but Engels said most. So this quote from Engels, I think just summarise what I've just said. The conflict of interest between classes made it impossible for the privileged class to maintain its privilege without an armed force controlling it. So the armed force was the first thing that represented the state. How to keep people in order, how to keep slaves in order, how to, in feudal society, no democracy, it was divine right of kings, how to just basically keep order and keep property safe. So, I can't do it left hand with my. Oh, I'm going to try.
Roll it towards.
Okay. Right. So, this is too much for you to read, and I did try and print this out just to hand it out. But the essence of what each of them said. This is, of course, about the introduction to Marxism, so I'll make no apologies just for quoting Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Marx didn't say much. There's a lovely little sentence in Volume 3 of Capital. He talks about the relations of production revealing the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure, basically corresponding to that, the specific form of the state. So the relation of sovereignty and dependence. Engels said this quote, which I'm sure you can't, well, you can read it, but the essence of it is to look at the different modes of production and the corresponding kind of state, slavery, serfdom, bondage, wage labour. So the state basically represented the different forms of class society. And again, Lenin talks about, well, it's something that we'll have to come back to, because he talks about after the fall of absolutism, i.e. the absolute monarchies, like actually in France or in Russia, Catherine the Great, Germany, Frederick the Great. He says that after the fall of absolutism, two institutions most characterise the state machine. And he adds to the standing army the bureaucracy, which we'll come to in a moment. So it becomes more developed as class society becomes more complex in a way. Okay, so let's get on to the modern state. This is the famous quote from the Communist Manifesto, which probably you've all heard before. The executive of the modern state is nothing but a committee for managing the entire affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Now, I said the state is more complicated now than it was even in Lenin's time, certainly in Marx's time. In a way, it's become more and more complex. And I'd say that there are three important elements to the state. The bureaucratic apparatus. What do you think that is?
Which one, sir?
The bureaucratic apparatus.
Civil service?
The civil service.
Civil service.
Yeah. The ideological apparatus. What would you say that is? Sorry?
Education?
Education, yes.
The laws.
Law.
Legislation, to some extent.
But, not quite no, I wouldn't say so. Come on to that. The media, the mass media. Anything else? Sorry? Schools, education, yes. So think of all the things that control your mind. So it's the mass media, isn't it? I mean, that's television. It's also social media, actually. Although we think we control it, as we realised last week when we looked at Facebook, we don't control anything. Remember, those of you who were here last week, that was one of the questions, wasn't it? Was how did Facebook make their profits? Anyway, so there's a vast array of the means by which your mind is controlled. Marx said that the ruling ideas in any society are those of the ruling class. So how does the ruling class get their ideas over? Well, in the past, before there was mass literacy, what do you think was the way of getting ideas across to the mass of the people?
The government mechanism,
Sorry?
the laws.
What? No, not the laws, not yet.
The church?
Sorry?
The government.
What?
Theatre and church.
Church was the key thing. Theatre, not many poor people couldn't go to the theatre, but they did go to church. And the pulpit was the means, really, of disseminating the line, if you like. I mean, of course there were divisions within the church, but it was the key thing. Nowadays, well, not many people go to church anyway, but they don't. It doesn't matter, because if you think about how the popular press and indeed television is controlled by well, the popular press is controlled by about 3 people. One person in particular, Rupert Murdoch, who controls Fox, who controls, the whole lot, and blinking cricket as well. He controls that. Well, I love cricket, by the way, so I'm really annoyed about that. That he made this big concession that we could see the final of the World Cup. He allowed it to be on Channel 4. That's Murdoch deciding who can see what. Anyway, so the ideological apparatus is absolutely, it is so much more expanded than ever before. And after when education became free and compulsory by 1890, that's when the popular press developed. The yellow press, the broadsheets, which really were there to control people's minds, but it's expanded massively since then. The third thing or element of the state, I've called the repressive apparatus.
The army.
Yes, the army, police. But basically that, isn't it? I mean, it can be all sorts of other things, but at the moment, certainly in this country, it's the army and the police. So the repressive apparatus is usually held in reserve, but it's there to stop protest, or certainly to act as a barrier to revolutionary change. I haven't mentioned Parliament.
That's to fool the people into thinking you're living in a democracy.
Yes. So you see, you'll keep going on about legislation. That Parliament passes legislation. Is Parliament part of the state?
I'll say yes, it can be.
Yes.
Even though we elect it? It's part of the state?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Elections.
I said before that it's the sort of window dressing of the state. This is, we live in what we call a democracy. I would call it a bourgeois democracy. We have a vote, so it looks as though we're controlling things because we can elect people to do our business for us. But okay, so Parliament does fit in, but it fits in not in the way that we are led we're led to believe, i.e. that if we control Parliament, we control the state. I'm going to come on to that in a minute when we talk about revolution, because it's essential that we understand that Parliament does not control the state. And I think this is an interesting point about Parliament, because let's go on to the next thing. I raised the question, what happens when the ruling class don't agree? What's the role of Parliament then? And we're living in this particular time right now, where we see a split in the interest of the ruling class, i.e. the Tory party split. Do you agree?
Yes.
And Parliament doesn't really exist, does it? And yet the country still runs.
Because the same ruling class are there all the time.
Exactly. Operating through the state. So the civil service basically, I'll give you a classic example, even if you don't want to think about broken Britain at the moment. Northern Ireland has not had an assembly for the last 3 years. It hasn't had any form of so-called democratic government. Who runs Northern Ireland? It is the Northern Ireland office of the British state. The Northern Ireland office of the British state, basically, that's where the traffic still runs, the street lights are still on, all of those things happen. Nobody has noticed the absence of, they've noticed the absence of a parliament, but it hasn't stopped society from functioning, or that society from functioning. And the Northern Ireland office basically is civil servants. And those civil servants actually have got amazing responsibility if anything goes wrong. And as a result, they are, and I actually talked to one quite recently, and she said this, they are risk averse. They won't do anything that's too dramatic, like, for example, repealing their repressive abortion laws or anything like that. They will keep things ticking over. In other words, it doesn't seem to matter that there isn't an elected assembly because things are still running. It does matter, of course, but but it makes my point about Parliament and the state. Not, the state still is there behind Parliament, even if Parliament doesn't exist. And at the moment, where we've got a totally fractured ruling class, and we'll come on to that in a moment, why that is the case, nevertheless, we are still governed. Yes? Do you agree with me or not?
Yes.
Yes.
Isn't this country a bit different because we've still got the Queen who heads the state, and in reality she still has a lot of prerogative powers?
Yeah, but
influence.
do you really think so? I mean,
I'm not. Well, she's, I'm not sure. I thought, well, she made that.
well, there's talk.
Through the institutions of the state that you've just been discussing.
Yes, I mean, she could be used, and Boris Johnson would like to use her because of the threat of proroguing Parliament.
That's exactly what he's trying to do. So I think she still has a role.
Well, except she hasn't as an individual. Nobody has an individual. The civil service will carry on, and they will, if Parliament is prorogued, it will mean nothing to them. It's a bit like the state of Northern Ireland at the moment, without an assembly. Things would still go on. Let me get on to the next part of the state, which is the state that we are, the even more modern state. Oh. Yes. We say that we are now in an era of state monopoly capitalism. Does anybody know what that means? You've heard it before. It's often used, isn't it? You could have
Finance capital.
So Mary, sorry.
So the state is controlled by big business and finance capital.
Yes.
It's the dominant controlling features of our society.
Yes.
Capitalist society.
Exactly. So it's almost melded into one. State monopoly capitalism kind of defines it quite nicely, because we've already seen monopoly capital is the merger of industrial and finance capital. And the state now is merged into that in a major way. So, for example, if you take the Bank of England, do you remember what the previous government did with the Bank of England?
It gave independence from the state.
Yes. Nominal independence, but not really, because it's still the government that appoints the director of the Bank of England. And the Bank of England is absolutely deeply linked into every economic process of society. And then if you look at the composition of government as well, you've got, and this is one of the reasons for the division within the Tory party, you have got the interest of finance capital represented massively, but finance capital is slightly divided. I mean, this is a big argument, and I won't go into it now. But they're melded together in ways which I think it's very difficult to unpick, and you would need to be a pretty great expert to do it. But the implications for parliamentary democracy are massive. And they're massive because if we're saying that the state and finance and monopoly and monopoly capitalism are intertwined, then it makes our choice at parliamentary elections even more limited, because we've got this absolute merger of the two elements of the state, the economic and the bureaucratic. So it does mean, though, that and I don't want to spend too much time on it because I haven't got much time, that when there are divisions within capitalism, as there are at the moment, it makes the role of the state even more important. But there are divisions, and the divisions over Europe are real ones, and they're economic ones as well. But I'm going to leave that just because there's going to be something that I want you to think about when we break into groups. So, where am I now? Okay, we're on to revolution, actually. So that if we understand the state then as not being neutral, we could see that, okay, even though we've got the vote, the fact is that we can't, even if we won a very good parliamentary majority for socialist change, we've still got the state to contend with. because the state, if you accept the argument, it represents the interest of the ruling class, i.e. those who own and control the means of production. It's still there, whatever government we've got.
Yeah.
So, this is where we have to discuss what a revolution actually is. And again, there's many views, but I'm distilling it into two views. One is that it is a revolution is a change of state power from one class to another, or others would say it's a change of government by means of rebellion, a coup d'etat, or an election of a very radical government, which we could possibly have in this country. Which of those two views do you prefer?
Rebellion.
The rebellion. Well, what is the rebellion? Do you think if what I've just said, well, obviously that's the one I think is the right one, the first one. A revolution is not a change of government. It's not a rebellion. I'm going to go into the difference between revolutions and rebellions in a moment, but I think we have to see a revolution as changing state power from one class to another, and in that sense we haven't had many revolutions in the world, but I'm going to look at two and to see if that proves the point. And if you don't think it proves the point, then we'll say so, won't we?
Can't you say it could be two things, like coup d'etat and...
No, that's not a revolution. A coup d'etat is simply a coup d'etat. It's just changing from, say, a civilian rule to army rule. It doesn't change anything. It just changes the faces of the people who rule. And the rebellion may precede a revolution, but a rebellion is a rebellion. Let me say what I think about the difference that I see.
So part of Martha is attempted rebellion, which the society supported. 200.
No, it's a rebellion. Yes, a rebellion. Yes, a revolt. So, Marx said this, and I'm raising a query about it, because he said that no social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces have been developed and superior relations of production replace them. So, in other words, the material conditions for a revolution matures in the old conditions, and then I queried this and say it sounds to me as though that's economic determinism, and there's an element of truth in it, but if you think about the logic of that, does it mean that we just have to wait until there's a change in the mode of production and not do anything about it? And I would think not. It's quite true that we have to understand, as we did in a previous class, the one before last, the conflict between the forces and relations of production. In our day, we talk about that as the conflict between the capital and labour, the forces of production being capital, the relations of production being workers who have to sell their labour power for a wage in order to live. And there is a conflict, and we can see that in trade unions and all the rest of it. But the material basis for changing a mode of production doesn't just come about automatically. A mode of production doesn't automatically transfer itself organically. It's quite true that we have to look at those relations of production. We looked at, and when we did the thing on historical materialism, we saw how it was that within feudal society, capitalism was already beginning to develop, but it needed a push to get it there. It was beginning to develop, and the interest of those who were wanting to have, in fact, let's just prove it by looking at this. Ooh, do I get to the next one? Yes. I'm making a distinction in this slide. You see, I couldn't couldn't have shown you these pictures if I didn't have the PowerPoint. I'm only doing it to impress Richard, actually, because he's a Mr. PowerPoint man and I never am. So I'm saying that revolution is not the same as rebellion, and I've given examples there of 3 revolutions, 2 of which I'm going to talk about. I'd like to talk about all 3, but I know I haven't got time. And I've given examples of rebellions, which we would all support and think were fantastic, but they weren't revolution. One was the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, which was a revolt against feudal Jews, really. The second, Kett's Rebellion, was a fantastic thing, but it was again a rebellion against enclosures for sheep farming. Didn't change society. But I'm not dismissing it because of that. I'm not dismissing it at all. The European revolutions of 1848, which Marx wrote about a lot, they actually, strictly speaking, were not revolutions. They didn't change state power. They might have changed a fraction of a class, for example, from, in French terms, the haute bourgeoisie to the finance bourgeoisie, but it was not a revolution. I think they're misnamed as revolutions. In fact, that's what all Marx is writing, Class Struggles in France, what he actually proves, that they were these were risings. They were premature. He even calls the Paris Commune of 1871 a premature revolution, a premature workers' revolution, and that's the Paris Commune.
Who was Kett?
Kett, they were 2 brothers who led this. And their surname was Kett, and they led this, it was mainly in Norfolk and Suffolk, they led this major rising against the sort of the more capitalist agriculture who were enclosing their land for sheep farming. And it wasn't only in Norfolk, actually they took over the town of Norwich and held it for I think something like 100 days. It was amazing, against the armies of Protector Somerset, and it was a battle. I mean, a huge battle, and there were risings against enclosures for sheep farming all over England. But eventually, they were quashed. But pretty amazing that they happened. So I want to talk just about why I think that's different from a revolution, by looking at the English Revolution first of all, of 1640, and then the Russian Revolution. And I can never work out how to do this. Okay, yes, the English Revolution. Oh my goodness, I can't do this. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so I say that the English Revolution of 1640, everybody calls it the Civil War, but actually there was a revolution. And this revolution changed state power from one class to another. Basically, it abolished feudalism. And it transformed from feudal wealth, from feudalism, it became a merchant and landowning capitalist wealth. And the similar thing happened in France in 1789. It wasn't the same, but it was similar. But I only say it wasn't the same because what happened in France is that although feudalism was abolished, peasant proprietorship became the absolute order of the day. That wasn't true in England. In fact, the peasantry became an agricultural labour force, and the richer ones became yeomen. But the point about the English Revolution was that it was Christopher Hill, who is I think the foremost Marxist historian of this period, and it's the most interesting period imaginable, and it's the one that's completely underplayed in all British history. They don't talk about they talk about the period after the Charles I was had his head chopped off. They call that period where there was no monarch the interregnum. It's always called that, the period between the reigns, as though it was the only natural thing in British society ever for us to have a monarchy. You couldn't conceive of that a protectorate, a republic, which it was under Cromwell, who wasn't a great man, but nevertheless it was a republic. You don't hear that. It's always called in every standard British history textbook the interregnum. Anyway, the point about this revolution was that it did change state power from one class to another, not to the working class, of course. There wasn't a working class there. There was an artisan class, but the working class did not exist until we had a fully fledged capitalist mode of production, as we did from the end of the 18th century onwards. So the Civil War, Christopher Hill says, was a class war in which the despotism of Charles I, who represented feudalism, Charles I was defended by the reactionary forces of the established church and the conservative, actually feudal landlords, and on the other side stood the trading and industrial classes in town and country. That was the clash between it. But no revolution can succeed unless it mobilises lots of other people, i.e. the people who are poor. Those poor people don't necessarily get anything out of it, but they assist, whether they like it or not. And also, in a way, there were two potential revolutions there. I'll come on to that in a minute. So Christopher Hill, I think, just sums it up beautifully. And he says that the old ruling class, anyway, the thing is that if we'll forget about the next bit, but the essence of it is that there was a change in class power. Feudalism ended. It really actually did end. Feudalism did not exist after 1642. It really didn't. And you contrast this, by the way, to Russia. Serfdom was not abolished in Russia, feudalism, serfdom, until 1861. In 1861 in this country, the Metropolitan Underground Railway line opened. I always remember those two dates. What a contrast between advanced capitalism and really backward feudalism. 1861 in Russia. I mean, that's 2 centuries basically after this country. So you can't get developed capitalism if you have feudalism and serfdom, people tied to the land. You can't have it. So that's what the change in a mode of production, why it's so significant. So I said before that the English Revolution utilised the forces of the masses to actually support this newly developing merchant class. And this, the forces of the masses, but when I say the masses, there wasn't a working class. As I said before, there were small landowners and there were artisans, and they were very radical. And this is why Brian Manning, who's another very important historian of this period, says that there were 2 revolutions in mid-17th century England. The one that succeeded established the rights of property, the abolition of feudal tenures and so on, and gave political power to the property, the sovereignty of Parliament, common law, the abolition of the prerogative courts and so on. And removed all impediments to the triumph of the ideology of the men of property. And thereby, his ideology was the Protestant ethic. And I'm sure you've all heard of that book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, quite different from the Catholic ethic. But of course, religion is only really important as an ideology, and the Catholic Church represented, in a sense, Charles I and feudalism, and this form of Protestantism, this self-made man type Protestant ethic, really was the spirit of capitalism. But Brian Manning says, and he's absolutely right, there was another potential revolution which never happened, because there was a tremendous movement from below of a very important organisation, which is, almost like a party, the Levellers and the Diggers. You may have heard of them, and they represented the real the beginnings of phenomenal radical tradition in this country. they were the basis of the new model army, which was actually quite a revolutionary army. It had its own democracy within it. It elected agitators. They had this phenomenal thing which Tony Benn actually has written about, the Putney debates, where they called for an agreement with the people. They were almost wanting a kind of constitution. They were defeated, and you might know that there's a commemoration each year at Burford where the last of the Leveller leaders was executed, actually by Cromwell. They were very radical. That's why Brian Manning always says that there was almost another revolution. But I think it makes the point really that for the propertied class to triumph, they used the mass of the people, but of course then betrayed them, but for obvious reasons. However, in 1917, that didn't happen. Where is the next? Oh yes, there we go. In 1917, this was somewhat different, and this is whatever one thinks about what happened to the Soviet Union. I'm not going into why it collapsed or why blah blah blah. That period from 1917 to 1922 needs to be really studied and understood, because that was a period of, well, it was the first worker state was created. Won't go into why it didn't last, but I want to just say that this revolution happened in a country that was least expected, in the sense that everybody would have said, and everybody did say, all the Marxists said, all the people in the social democratic parties, that the revolution would occur in the country that had the most advanced and numerous working class. That would have been Germany or this country, where industrialisation was had started in this country. German workers had a massive social democratic party, not entirely Marxist, but there were Marxists within it, and yet the revolution happened in the most, what you might call, backward economically country. 80% of the Russian population were peasants. 20% only were industrial workers. So quite surprising. And this is, I think, and I have to make a special, well, not a special plea, that's not the point, but to make a special mention of the importance of Lenin. Lenin developed Marxist theory in his day for Russian conditions. And there were two massively important books that Lenin wrote, apart from State and Revolution, and all the ones that people know about. One book was called The Agrarian Question, and the other was called The Development of Capitalism in Russia. Those two books basically underpinned an argument which has been used in third world countries where they haven't got a developed working class. The Indian communists use this argument, and all over Asia and Africa this argument has been used. Essentially what Lenin says, that it is quite wrong to see the peasantry as a homogeneous whole. They weren't just one block of reactionary anti-progress people. He saw within the peasantry that there were three elements to it. The kulaks were the rich peasants, the middle peasants, pretty, a smaller portion, but the vast majority of the peasants were poor, very, very poor peasants who couldn't actually survive just on their little plots, who had to then sell their labour power to richer peasants because they couldn't actually feed off their own land. And that peasantry, the mass of that peasantry, the 80%, roughly 80%, were not hostile to socialist ideas. That was proved in the 1905 revolution, where the peasants played a very, very big role. Stolypin, who was, I won't go into the detailed history, but they made an attempt to make land reforms and so on. But the point about the land is, of course, that the big landowners owned most of it. So that's where there was a conflict between agrarian capitalism and so on. I better not go into that, but the point about the peasantry is that what Lenin said, it was possible, and it had to be possible, for workers and peasants to share the same interests. Hence the slogan of the revolution, peace, bread and land, which I'll come on to that in a moment. There were actually two revolutions in 1917. The first one in February basically got rid of the Tsar, and a provisional government was set up. But the period between February and October was a period of the dual power, and this period is very important because it was during that period that the Bolshevik Party, which could be called was a vanguard party, mobilised in a way which was not capitalised, what's the wrong word, but got together workers, soldiers and peasants into Soviets, and these Soviets sprung up all over Russia at this time. And the Soviets were basically workers' councils. And when I say there's a dual, what he called it a dual power, it was called the dual power because you had a provisional government on the one hand which actually didn't govern, and then you had within society developing forms of self-government, workers, soldiers and peasants. Workers, because of the appalling nature of exploitation, Russia had industrialised its 20% at any rate, very rapidly, huge firms. Women played a massive role in this, and by the way, women were the leaders of the first revolution in February 1917. But the war was going on. That was the thing. Who was fighting the war? It was a conscript army. As we all know, the First World War was a ridiculous and stupid imperialist war that had no war aims. Nobody in Russia knew why they were fighting, and it's a conscript army with conscripts, obviously, but majority of them were peasants. And there was desertion from the front. It was appalling because the state could not continue to feed them, to clothe them, to even give them proper ammunition. So the slogan, peace, bread and land, appealed to everybody. Peace, that's what everybody wanted, or everybody who wasn't making profits out of the war. Bread, that's what people wanted to eat. And land, the peasants were that was the absolute, it was a phenomenal slogan to unite all three elements, workers, soldiers and peasants. So when the revolution, the October Revolution occurred, I mean, it was a peaceful, it was the one shot was fired from the battleship Aurora, and the Winter Palace was taken. It was the state collapsed. And you might then say, does that mean that revolutions need not be violent? Well, what happened afterwards? That was from the moment that took place, and the first decree was the decree on peace, where Russia removed herself from the war, herself from the war, and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. From that moment onwards, a counter-revolution began, and that counter-revolution, started by white Russians, i.e. the people who had whose wealth was going to be taken over by the new Soviet state, were then backed by the forces of 14 countries in the world, led by Britain, with 5 years of wars of intervention.
4 years.
It was
1918 to 20.
No, it was 1917. So the White Russians began that they were supported massively by, I won't go into all the detail, but the point is that period was a revolution, the revolution that did survive. And the Red Army actually managed to defeat these forces, and that's raises a question which you're going to answer a bit later about the role of the Vanguard Party, if you think there is such a role. There certainly was a role for it then, that's for sure. So, where's this blinking thing going? Oh, it's not. It's this one. No wonder. So, just talking about Lenin, because obviously having been through he made a lot of wrote a lot about what a revolutionary situation and what a revolutionary is. He made a distinction between a revolutionary situation and a revolutionary crisis. First of all, he said that a revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation. Now, what did he define as a revolutionary situation? It's in essence what these 3 points mean. That he said that a revolutionary situation occurs when the ruling class cannot rule in the old way and the masses of the people won't let it. There are 2 sides to it. In other words, the position of the ruling class is fractured, they can't carry on. Actually, that's probably something we've got today, but we haven't got the second thing, he said. I don't think, and we can discuss this later, that the masses are not prepared to let the ruling class go on in the old way. So there's 2 sides to it. That's a revolutionary situation. Do you follow that argument? So he said that situation doesn't automatically lead to a revolution, but these are the in which a revolution and a revolutionary crisis can occur. And I contrast this to what I quoted from Marx a while ago in a few slides back, when I said it was possibly economic determinism if you thought that somehow or other one mode of production would automatically go to another one without that push, without men and women making their own history. And this is what he's talking about here. And it's a complicated thing to say, well, why can't, if the ruling class can't go on in the old way? There is a crisis then in the mode of production, and a crisis that I think that we have here, because I think there is a ruling class crisis and there is a split in the interest of the ruling class. That doesn't mean we've got a revolutionary situation. And he also didn't mean that a revolutionary situation would lead to a revolution. He said there has to be a revolutionary crisis. So he went on to say it's not every revolutionary situation that gives rise to a revolution. It arises only out of a situation in which the objective changes, the ones I referred to before, are accompanied by a subjective change, the ability of the revolutionary class to take revolutionary mass action strong enough to break or dislocate, strong enough to break the old government, which never, not even in a period of crisis, falls if it's not toppled over. So there's nothing automatically about a crisis or a revolutionary situation which wouldn't lead to revolution. It doesn't just collapse. And we can see that here in Britain today. It hasn't collapsed. What would make it collapse though? And really what he's talking about here is class consciousness. The consciousness that could be inspired by those forces who can actually see what the unity of the working class should be about. In other words, not sectional interest, but a class interest. We've talked about consciousness a little bit before, but that consciousness doesn't just come like that. It's learned. And that's why we're all learning here. That's why I'm learning all the time. How does that revolutionary consciousness is not something that just automatically enters your brain, so that you can see that sectional interest, that there's something above sectional interest which are to do with the interest of the class. So how does this then play out here? What is to be done? To quote Lenin, in Britain today, can we learn anything from this history? Is this just a lot of waffle and hot air that I've been going on? Just, the Russian Revolution was 100 years ago, we can't learn anything from that. Can we learn anything from the theory? And how, in particular, can we avoid a situation where we do get a left-led Labour government? How can we avoid a very British coup? Have you all read Chris Mullen's Very British Coup? Well, basically, I think it's a situation of possibly life imitating art. In a very British coup, the scene is projected whereby the Labour Party elects a socialist leader. His name is Harry Perks. And then, guess what happens? That Labour Party then wins an election. And Harry Perks, the socialist, then becomes Prime Minister. The very British coup basically consists of not using the repressive apparatus of the state, not using the police or the army, but using the ideological apparatus of the state to convince everybody through the mass media, through MI5, through all sorts of things, that Harry Perks is mentally deranged. And in the end, they end up putting Harry Perks in a lunatic asylum, and the whole project comes tumbling down. It sounds so familiar. Oh, the civil, yes, the ideological apparatus, the bureaucratic apparatus, all colluded. MI5, the Secret Service, actually even America, using, defence. So it was all, you read the book, but it honestly, it could have been about who right now. So basically, I think this is true. I don't normally quote Britain's Road to Socialism, but I think this is dead right, that a left government has to expect attempts at economic, financial, and I would say actually ideological sabotage as well. All of that should be anticipated. If even the mildest of the left-wing programme, this is LWP policies, will meet with resistance inside the civil service and associated public bodies, including regulatory agencies, the Bank of England and the state. In other words, all aspects of the state machine. So the state itself will become a focal point for heightened class struggle. The state, this is the key thing, unless we understand that all of these things that are behind government are there and they would stop progressive change, then the question is, what do we do about it? Well, bear in mind what Lenin said, what a revolutionary crisis and a revolutionary situation is. The masses won't let it go on in the old way, and they're mobilised sufficiently in order to prevent it. Have we got those conditions in Britain today? Well, you're going to answer this, but I'm going to just... where am I going? Oh, what is to be done? How do I get there? Oh, back.
No, wonderful.
Back. Oh, yes. Okay, so what we've got in Britain today in terms of what the potential for mobilising a force which could prevent a very British coup. Well, we've got trade unions, and trade unions are actually at their weakest point since 1979. 12 million since 1979, now actually less than half of that. Trade unions are very important, we all know that. That Marx called them schools of communism, but trade unions on their own won't lead to a revolutionary crisis, being able to, because trade unions operate on the terrain of the economic struggle quite correctly, and the economic struggle won't spontaneously lead to a political struggle. They're sectional struggles, and that's not to say they can't be used, because collective action is vitally important, and in a way people learn through struggle, don't they? They learn through those sort of struggles, but it won't automatically lead to a political struggle without consciousness, class consciousness. So again, the struggle, and Lenin said that the struggle of workers becomes a class struggle only when the foremost representative, the entire working class, the whole country, are conscious themselves as a single working class and are conscious of their own interests, i.e. the interests of labour versus capital. So not that this is what consciousness is all about. So they understanding the need against the entire class of capitalists and the government, well, really the state in a way. So that means, therefore, how does that happen? Well, then we have to talk about the role of the vanguard party. And we have to say that within this country, the strength of the political left is fractured. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I mean, there's a problem, isn't there? We have got a problem. I'm not going to solve that problem because you're going to do that in a moment. So we have certainly got a world to win, but we do need to understand the essence of what the state is, that knowing that just changing the government is not necessarily going to give us what we want. And if it's a left government, then there will be a tremendous fight to destabilise it. Can only be protected by what we call extra parliamentary struggle, but that extra parliamentary struggle has to be mobilised and has to be conscious, and it could then lead to a revolutionary situation. It could, if we had the movement to do it. And I'm not being defeatist, but I'm just being honest and realistic. But I do think we can learn from what happened before, from what the essence of the state is and what the essence of revolution is, and acknowledge that we have to agitate, educate and organise. And now you're going to be organised, and Rich is going to organise this, I'm sure he will, because you're going to answer all the difficult questions that I've just raised but not answered. Why can't I use this bloody thing? Oh, there it is. There's questions. So, I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 questions. So do you want? You can do because I make a mess of it every time. So you do it.
You happy with these 6?
Well, I don't care whether you're happy about it or not. That's not the issue.
This
That's what.
Between the Vanguard Party and the sort of soft liberal. I put every time. We've got 12 people in the room. It's either 6 questions and working in groups of 2 with a coupling group of 3, or we cut down the questions. So we try and answer all 6?
Yes.
Okay, right. In that case, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, do you know your numbers? Yeah? So if group 1 would like to come down here, are we going to bother with parliamentary elections?
Should we?
Group 2, you can sit in the middle there, a bit further back.
Oh, it's not.
Must revolutions be violent?
No, numbers.
2, 3, or 1, 2.
I'm 1, am I?
You're 1. You're 2. You're
1.
We like to flow. We like to split up husband and wife.
3.